Okay, we are recording. And all right. It is wonderful for me to be able to introduce this morning longtime member Ron James, who has led adult forums many times in the past, and it's been a while, so I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about different portions of his life and experience in leadership and in the government. And I think it's going to be very fascinating. And let me read a little bit of his resume, just an introduction. Ron James and his wife have been members of the Covenant since 1985. Their children, Kelly, Shannon, and Catlin, were raised in the church. Ron has served as a trustee and is a member of session and on various committees. He's also served as a trustee of the Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Ron has served as a district attorney in Waterloo, Iowa, and has served as a senior executive under 3 U.S. presidents. Ron is a partner at the law firm of Squire Sanders for 25 years. He officially retired after serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Army in Washington, D.C. And with that, I am now going to introduce Ron. Good morning, Ron.
Morning, John, and thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And also, thank you for all of your help and support, because you know, tech skills, this would not be happening without your support. And it's a special honor to be here today to honor a man that I have great respect for, Carter G. Woodson.
Okay, so I'm going to screen share, and let me get, I haven't done this before.
Don't have to show. Okay.
Yeah. And then go to slideshow. Does everybody see that?
No.
No?
Not yet.
No, not yet.
Oh, it's got to show which photos, office.
Maybe I shouldn't have thanked him.
So,
Okay. Looking promising.
Yes.
oh, get this.
So try opening the slides.
All right, so I'm going to open the slides.
Less bad about
And then,
Wednesday night when I see this happening.
Who is running this? Do you know who's running?
John is trying to.
Are we on mute?
We should all mute.
oh, here we go.
We should be on mute.
Whoa. Oh, is that the joke?
How's that?
Yes, yes.
All right. Ron, do you see the slide?
Yes. And
All right. And I will, this is the title slide, so you'll have to tell me to move forward when you're ready.
yeah, the title of this, okay. This is a photograph. This is Carter Woodson, an American historian, a journalist, founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, one of the first scholars to study the history of African diaspora, including African American history, a founder of the Journal of American History. Just an incredible person, a lot more history, worked as a carpenter from a family of enslaved people in Virginia. And actually, before he went to college, he worked as a coal miner. Graduated from Berea College, got a PhD from Harvard University, absolutely phenomenal. Only the second African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard. The first was W.E.B. Du Bois. And the fascinating thing about this is that he saw this deficiency with regard to the telling of the story of my people, the story about African Americans and about their history, about their ignored history. And he was determined to do things to raise the race up in textbooks because they ignored our history and our achievements, our contributions. And he wanted to tell stories to counter those told by mainstream media, stories that were designed to, quote, keep Negroes in their place and why they needed to stay there. So in 1926, he pioneered the celebration of, quote, Negro History Week, designated for the second week in February to coincide with the marking of the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And for those of you who may not be acquainted with those two folks, I'd be happy to talk about them once we get to the text of this. One of the fascinating things I learned in the process of this is that subsequently, African American History Week, which started in 1926, became African American History Month. And it was primarily at the initiation of a group of Black African American students at Kent State University who argued that there was a need to expand this topic to an entire month. So on February the 1st of 1970, Gerald Ford, one of the presidents I had the opportunity to work for, decided to make it a national, a month of national honoring by saying February is now Black History Month in its entirety. Slide. Where is that? I just want to, before I start honoring one of the pioneers that is very personal to all of us, and who was really instrumental in teaching my children, Kelly and Shannon, about their roots and about their wings. And then after suffering through teaching the two of them, she also then took on Catlin. But before I get into that, let me just talk to you a little bit about my own personal experiences. I went to some exceptionally good public schools in Centerville, Iowa. But my own experience with my knowledge of my roots was lacking. African American history or history about Black folks was not taught. And rarely, if at all, it was about Booker T. Washington, who talked about things about, like, in all things purely social, we can be as the fingers, but in all things purely economic, we can be as the hand. To say the least, my education was inadequate or non-existent in high school. I attended a consolidated high school, and the story was the same. History was mostly about the accomplishments of white men of power, never about, quote, people of color, and occasionally about women. Never about the people of the lower caste. At Lincoln University, I attended my freshman year in college in 1955. I was in an African American history class. The first time I'd ever been in a class was like 90% African American. Had this really brilliant, bright, brash, Jamaican, Harvard educated professor. And I was an honor student. I can remember him chastising me. He said, "Young man, I don't know where you were educated, but you were obviously miseducated because you're talking about Africa as if it was a country. It is a continent. It has the second largest landmass in the entire world. It has over 50 countries." Unsaid, idiot. It was a humiliating experience, but it was an awakening. And then I went to University of Missouri, one of 20 students of color on a campus of some 20,000. Becoming part, once again, of that group of African Americans, which we could write a book about. The first, the highest, and the only. A group I hope my children will not have to learn about or have to do. But at the University of Missouri, history was taught as an economic model. And the Civil War was about the war of the rebellion, the reward because of the domination of the federal state, and war about states' rights. No discussion at all about enslavement and its horrors, the inhumanity. The Civil War was a sacred war. To say the least, my education at Missouri, which is a phenomenal school, great journalism school, one of the finest journalism schools in the country, a phenomenal political science department, but the history department was severely, severely lacking. And to sit in the class with 225 students in lectures and have to suffer through discussions about the Civil War as a war not about slavery, but about slave rights, but about the Civil War is a war about not about slavery, but a war about the rights of states. And unfortunately, even though we spent a lot of money and a lot of time, our children's education on this subject was lacking. Grade schools, Chanel, Hawken, Laurel, St. Anne's. I could just tell by their discussions and by what they would say to me that they were ignorant. And I put that in quotation marks, not out of any fault. And my wife, who never criticized me, said to me, Ron, you need to stop whining. You need to tell your children about your story, the story of your family, the story of your family's enslavement. And that's the motivation for this presentation. And that's the background for why I'm doing this presentation. And this is also the bottom line. It hasn't gotten much better. In fact, let me just give you a couple examples, and I have about 7 or 8 examples here. Perhaps you read about a high school overnight nature camp in Wisconsin recently that included an underground railroad situation where, according to one student, Black students had to pretend they were runaway slaves while the white students acted as slaves catchers or helpful abolitionists. And then there was a geography book that was, I know, used in Texas at least up into 2015 that described Africans as immigrants to the United States. Examples like these are just part of the problems that we face and that educators face, ill-prepared aspects of our history, African-American history. Sadly, the Southern Poverty Law Center revealed that the nation's teachers are reluctant to teach African-American history, and that they found when they were told to, the textbooks were inadequate. And the really sad news, according to the Southern Poverty Law Fund, is that only 8% of recent high school graduates could identify the central cause of the Civil War being slavery. And this is a time as America grapples with the history of injustice. Our ignorance level is at an all-time high. And I wish I had better news for you, but like about 4 months ago, a spokesman for our president and a senior official at the Department of Education indicated that we're really not sure there's a need in this day and age for the teaching of diversity and about classes, about folks that's based on their racial identity or their caste or class. Sad. We've come a long way, but we have an awful long way to go. That's depressing, but let me hold up some heroes and sheroes. And let me start with slide. He's got it up. Yeah.
Oh, there it is.
John Irma Singleton, pioneer. Like to think of her as a member of our adopted family. Youth pastor for our 3 children, role model for our daughters. The verbal dismarry for our son, so I would avoid doing it in other fashions. A really role model as a strong, Black, loving, gracious, caring woman at the Church of the Covenant for over 25 years. One of the first African-American, not one of the first, the first African-American woman graduate from Union Theological Seminary. She is dearly missed. Not only as a minister to our church, but as a role model, as one of those who paved the way for people like me to stand in very high places and to acknowledge that, but for people like her, I would not have had the opportunities to stand in high places, because I really stand in these high, I've stood in these high places because I stand on the shoulders and the prayers and the wishes and the sacrifices of people like her. And like the people of my great-grandfather, slide. This is my great-great-grandfather, Alexander Hogan. Alexander Hogan, born, we're not quite sure, but probably about 1842 in the slave state of Missouri, probably about the age of 16 or so, escaped from slavery, ran across the slave state of Missouri to the free state of Kansas because there was a war going on. And he went to Kansas to enlist, to become a member of the U.S. Army. And he was told when he got there that we don't need you. This is a white man's war. Those were not the words of Abe Lincoln, but that was the policy of Abe Lincoln initially, was that Black troops could not fight on the side of the Union Army in the Civil War. About a month later, after the South had won 3 decisive battles, Lincoln decided, well, things are getting tough. Black folks can now fight in the Union Army. So my great-grandfather, enlisted in the Army, and his corporate war records are before you. In some, it also lists a number of the significant battles he fought in. He rose to the rank of corporal. He fought in places like Arkansas and Mississippi, and because of the time consequences, I want to focus on one battle, which we'll talk about even more later. It's called the Battle of Fort Pillow. It was in a battle in Tennessee, about two years or so into the war. And at Fort Pillow, while my great-grandfather's not involved in a specific battle, there was this one battle where there were a group of about 3 platoons of African-American soldiers commanded by white officers who were trapped right on the ramparts, right on the edge of the river. And they were trapped there by Confederate soldiers. And the African-American soldiers dropped their weapons and tried to surrender. And there's a really fascinating article that's published in Harper's Magazine that you might want to look at if you want to see the details. But like, so these African-Americans tried to drop their weapons. And this was the troops from the Confederacy were commanded by General Bedford, who was the second ranking general, the cavalry general under Robert E. Lee, and absolutely, despite my feelings personally about him, was absolutely incredibly brilliant general. But basically, when Confederate troops asked Bedford, what should we do? They want to surrender. Bedford apparently said something like, kill the nigger-loving officers and all of those black bastards. And it's said that the river ran red for at least a day because of the slaughter of the African-American soldiers at Fort Pillow. And it is told, it is that one of the legends that for those like my father who continue to fight, my great-grandfather who continued to fight, it is told that when they would go into battle after that, they would always indicate never surrender, never give up. Remember Fort Pillow. And the Army has this is a slight digression, but the Army has this motto: never leave a fallen comrade behind. And that decree comes from this experience, because the African-American soldiers, like my great-grandfather, knew that if they left a wounded buddy behind, that they would be killed at worst, or perhaps if they were, quote, lucky, they might have a foot chopped off so they could not run away when they were returned to slavery. That's the story, and there's more, of one of my heroes and heroes. My great-grandfather, Alexander Hogan. Slide.
Yeah, he's got it.
Then, no, I need this slide.
Oh, there's this.
Another hero, Robert E. Lee Smith. What do you think about that name? And if I had time, I'd talk to you about the history of African Americans picking names after people who had enslaved them. And I don't say that critically. I just say that was a matter of getting along, getting by. My grandfather's father probably had done that to please the boss or the plantation owner. Anyway, he was born in 1871, Robert E. Lee Smith. At about the age of 16 or 17, we're not quite sure, he came north on the Illinois Central Railroad from Mississippi or Kentucky. We know he lived in both places. He came to Iowa to work in deep, dark shaft coal mines. Coal mines are like 500 or more feet down into the ground. And he came because, and you will pardon the expression, he came because the Chinks and the dumb Polacks and the Dagos, the Italians, who had these good jobs in the coal mine, had the audacity to strike. And so the coal mining managers and owners brought in black folks to work in the mines. And the short version of the story is that the coal mine strikes were broken, and my grandfather, Robert E. Lee, worked in deep, dark shaft coal mines. God, that's courage. I mean, I've been down there. I couldn't, I don't have the guts or the fortitude. It's so dark you can't see your face. And he would also, when he got promoted, as I understand it, he would take a canary with him because there was no way to tell about how much carbon monoxide there was. And as a crew leader, he would take these canary with him because if he saw the canary dying or dead on the ground, he knew that he needed to get his men out. He worked hard. He raised 7 girls, 1 boy. One boy died. All of them finished high school, which is absolutely incredible, except one. And one of them was my mother, as I said. And the phenomenal thing is that it's just marvelous because my great-great-grandfather, Alexander Hogan, and reason we're really not quite sure of his name, because on the certificate, you can't see it. Hogan is spelled O-G-A-N. We have reason to believe he could not read and or write because on a couple of the documents, there are X's. And I tell these stories because, and I need to tell these stories to my children because they need to appreciate the sacrifices and the depth of the humiliation that their people, my ancestors have gone through to raise us to this place in this time. Still with problems, but still with just incredible opportunities and the like. How am I doing for time?
Not good. You need to hurry along.
Okay,
Slide.
slide. That's Robert E. Lee.
And just keep it going quickly.
Next slide. That's his wife, Delia. Next slide.
And for the reception, please.
So I cannot tell you the number of people in my life who have given me wings. The Branch Rickeys in my life, and I'm sure as most of you recall, Branch Rickey was the white Major League Baseball club owner who made it possible for Jackie Robinson at long last in 1946-47 to have an opportunity to play baseball in the major leagues. And time will not permit for me to do a full round of acknowledgments, but there was Jim Bromwell, a Iowa congressman who in 1963 and 1964 basically hired me as a law student, as a law school. And he was on the House Judiciary Committee, giving me the opportunity to work on the Civil Rights Act of 1963, the Equal Pay Act of 1960, Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65. From a predominantly white congressional district at a time when there were only 4 other Black professional staff working on congressional offices in the House of the United States. And then there's Don Rumsfeld, who on many occasions was the wing beneath my wings, a freshman congressman who was elected in 1964-65 as a congressman from a very rich, very well-educated, 95% white congressional district in Chicago. And he was able to, I was able to do that in large part because my Aunt Bernice, whose name I skipped over, who was more like almost like a mother, was a union rep with Forshine Shoes. And I went to Rumsfeld's office to ask for a job because even though I was from Iowa, I pretended I was from the state of Illinois. And then there are others like Dave Andrews, a white partner at a significant law firm in Seattle, Washington, senior member of the American Bar Association, who tried hard to get me hired as their first African-American, quote, partner in the law firm. And I can remember him coming to me with the tears in his eyes saying, this was in 1962, 1960, no, this was in 1975. Came to me with tears in his eyes saying, I can't.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Maybe it
was yes. That's my editorial person who keeps me honest on the side. Anyway, who told me with tears in his eyes that how disappointed he was. But he was a branch rookie at heart. He just was not successful. I became a partner at Squire Sanders and Dempsey in 1976, 77. Thanks in large part to Jim Davis, the managing partner, people like John Lewis. And the reason I became a success at Squire Sanders and Dempsey was because of the tutoring and having a great blocking back by Charlie Clark, an incredible, kind, Christian person, a long-standing member of the Church of the Covenant. And he was my shield, and at times he was my sword. And there are many more branch rookies, but time does not permit me to talk about them, because I want to turn to you about another battle, which has a timely historical significance for a number of reasons. This is sometimes referred to as the battle, America's battle insurrection. This is a story that has as its background the efforts of James Meredith to integrate the University of Mississippi. The litigation started about 1961. And when Meredith was finally successful, it was ordered that he be admitted into the university. And as some of you may recall, Governor Barnett stood in the door of the university and said several things that I cannot repeat in a church listening audience. But Barnett basically turned him away and said he would never, as long as he was the governor of Mississippi, would a black man ever go to the law school at the University of Mississippi. So the Kennedys, slide.
No, that was.
Yeah.
Out Little Rock, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, remember, go back to that just briefly. Yeah. No, go
Back,
back. Yeah. Going forward. If you can't go back, that's fine.
yeah.
Okay.
No, that's good.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. No. Anyway, the slide before that was
What's after that?
no, the slide before the this slide is really about the integration of the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. So that was the first time that where there'd been a reluctance to integrate, there'd been violence, and reluctance is an understatement, that federal troops were called in. And at that time, I was a member of the 101st Airborne Division. I'd graduated from the University of Missouri and was an officer with 101st Airborne. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was, strike that. Yeah, when I was a student cadet at the University of Missouri in 1957, ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Program. And when I saw these soldiers with these Eagles patches on their shirts, escorting these little black boys and little black girls into Central High School, enforcing the law, I said to myself, that's the unit I want to belong to. Next slide. So I became a member of the 101st Airborne Division. Next slide. Became a paratrooper, jumped out of airplanes. Next slide.
That's cute.
Yeah.
So.
I need a blank space, John. Okay. But it's okay. Yeah. You can just need a blank space here. But yeah, this is ahead.
But just go on about that.
Anyway, don't worry about it. I'll handle it.
One of the guys at Little Rock that you thought was so Gordon.
Yeah.
What his name was,
this guy here,
if they had put hat on.
remember this guy here with the hat on. He was, at the time I was saying, that's who I want to be like. Those soldiers, I want to be with them. I want them to be my battle buddies. This was their commanding general at the time. Next slide. Okay.
Well, just
Oh,
over
that's
time.
okay. So it's now, no, you're fine, John. I'm sorry. Yeah. So it's, for those of you who don't know, this is my daughter Kelly. And why is she in here right now? Because I want to talk to you about the insurrection, about what happened.
Got it right.
About what happened at the Battle of Oxford, the battle involving the to get James Meredith into the school, the law school, and about what it took. And it's a story I told to Kelly. And she had encouraged me to expand on the story, and she actually has used the parts of the story I'm going to tell you to conduct a leadership seminar for her partnership, her educational, for the educational partnership she's in Seattle, Washington. Next slide.
Oh, that's different. than That was the end of, no,
Yeah,
we
okay.
need to go back to Little Kelly to talk about the Battle of Oxford.
Okay, I screwed up. Can you go back?
That's all right. They're just told by the Battle.
Yeah,
of Oxford.
okay. So let me tell you about the Battle of Oxford. This would be September the 30th, 1962. About 50 U.S. Marshals are escorting James Meredith into the school. They are then backed up and supported by about another 25, 30 U.S. Marshals. They then called in about another 75 members of the U.S. Border Patrol. They then called in a unit of the Mississippi National Guard. And by this time, there were probably about 1,500, 2,000 rioters roaming around the campus of the University of Mississippi, led by General Edwin Walker, the former General Edwin Walker, now retired, former member of the 101st, former leader of the 101st Airborne Division. And despite all of these, quote, federal law enforcement employees on the ground in Oxford, much like what has recently happened at our US Capitol, they were overwhelmed. They simply couldn't handle it. So they called in the elite troops, the 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, and others. And I happen to be among those. And the short version of the story is that we flew to the campus, and we cleared the campus. And after we cleared the campus, we were told we were going to be able to stay there. But about 18 hours after we were there, a 3-star general came around, and he basically said, did a roll call. He basically said, all of the black officers, were not that many, and all of the units on the ground should fall back to the cantonment area, to the rear area, and that the black enlisted personnel could stay in Oxford, but they had to turn in their weapons, they had to get rid of their helmets, and they had to get rid of their ammunition belts, and they were assigned to do KP, that is kitchen duty. They were assigned to pick up tear gas canisters. They were assigned to do laundry. They were assigned to sweep the roads. They were assigned to clean up the campus, cut down trees, and in other words, required to do minimal labor. What was happening in effect is apparently at the intervention of a racist senator from Mississippi, was chair of the Armed Services Budget Committee. Bob Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the President Kennedy agreed that the Army could be resegregated for purposes of this exercise. That is, black troops, black soldiers could not fight on American soil, especially when it involved white people. The short version of my exit interview, or what they call after action report interview after this event, was that when I went back to the the colonel there told me that the reason that the black officers had been pulled out of the battle, and it was a battle, was because they did it to protect our lives. Because black officers, especially the handful, were being targeted by the snipers being commanded by General Walker, the former leader of 101st Airborne Division. So I said some inappropriate things to the debriefer about, like, so when I go to Vietnam and they're trying to kill me and they're targeting officers, are you going to pull me out of the battlefield? And he's, yeah, you're going to pull me out of line of fire. And he says, young man, you have an attitude problem. And I says, I'll show you an attitude problem. So I went and got a piece of paper and I went back to him and I gave him my resignation. And I think I may have said some inappropriate things about where you could stick my resignation, about someplace where the sun doesn't shine. So then I found myself back in Fort Campbell, and I found myself waiting for a court martial. And Colonel Kinzer, a white Southern colonel who had promoted me to the position of the intelligence officer for Division Artillery, he said to me, I understand you've resigned your commission. And I said, yep. And he says, you know, it looks like our unit is going to Cuba and we're going to invade Cuba. And I said to myself, this guy is going to order me to go to Cuba. And I'm going to tell him. And he said to me, he said to me, I need you. And your men need you. So the next day, next slide. Oh, next slide. Back again. No, let's have to,
That's all right.
just the next slide. I'll work with Jen. Just find the one. Okay, next slide. Next slide. The next slide. Okay.
So you were on your way to Cuba.
This is the one. It's a picture, John, of the in the tent.
No, there.
Okay. So this is a bunker at Ellis Air Force Base in Cuba, and we're actually in a tent, and we're actually plotting artillery concentrations for missile sites and targets of opportunity on the island of Cuba for our invasion. Next slide.
That's the end of it.
And that's the end of the Battle of Oxford.
You only have like 10
I'm going to do that. Yes. Okay.
Okay, they're back to Washington.
Good. So this is a John Dunlap, another person who paved the way for me. Brilliant economist, phenomenal guy. Gave me the opportunity to be in charge of the second largest enforcement operation in the United States government in 1972, 73, 75, 70, okay. The wage and hour division of the Department of Labor, minimum wage, overtime, equal pay, Davis-Bacon service contracts, that is all of the supervision of pay on federal contracts. An immense, incredibly a job that historically had felt that was too complex for somebody who was black or was colored to handle because it involved economics. Also sat on the board that reviewed the economic projections, the labor economic projections for the United States, labor reports and the like. I have a master's degree in economics, never got one, never got a PhD in economics, but I feel that this guy, John Dunlap, this wonderful man, this gentle, brilliant man, clearly was another one of the individuals, the Rickies, the Branch Rickies who paved the way for the things I was able to accomplish. And I think if my children are ever going to be able to have some of the opportunities I have, they too will need Branch Rickies or their female counterparts in their lives.
All right, you just want to go through and
Yes.
catch up there to the other
Yes. Next slide.
pictures.
That's Rumsfeld, who I've already talked about, and that person standing next to me is the best thing that ever happened in my life. Next slide. And the only reason Dick Cheney was in here because John wanted me to keep him in. Dick Cheney and I worked in the White House together, the reason I put this in here is because Dick went on to become vice president, and look where I am. But we shared an office on the second floor of the West Wing of the White House, and while I worked for Rumsfeld in the Nixon White House. And the reason I wanted this picture in here is because I owe Dick an apology. Because I remember when I early on worked for Don Rumsfeld, I did a paper on a fairly complex subject, and he actually just tore the paper to shreds, and he bit me, pardon my expression, in my butt. And I was thinking, that guy is just, I thought he was a good white guy. So I'm walking out of the office, and there's Dick Cheney sitting at his desk, and it's like 7:30, early for us, PM. And I said, Dick, I'm going home. And I said, you want to go? No, he says, I got to do an all-nighter. And I looked down on his desk. He says, the boss wants this done and on his desk by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. And there was this paper that had red lines and marked out stuff. And I hope I didn't smile too much. But Rumsfeld would be a lot of things, but he was not a racist. He was a damn good boss. And he was especially the reason I was able to go on and do a number of other things, like become the second highest ranking person in the Department of the Army, the Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, even on occasions act as the acting Secretary of the Army. So next slide. That's
Next
at,
slide.
yeah, that's, I'm going to say something.
Oh.
That again is I'm getting a lot of editorial comment on the side. I'm sure, John, that never happens to you. The reason this is in here, because I want to tell you one story about my wife. At the time I was working for Richard Nixon, she was working for Adlai Stevenson, and we were at a dinner for the president of France, a White House dinner, really fancy dinner. She's sitting at the table next to me. And the short version of that story is that one of the ladies was just gloating and not gloat. One of the ladies was just going on and on about how wonderful it must be to work for someone who was in an office on the second wing, in the attic of the second wing of the White House, you know, and was working for the President of the United States. And my wife said something like, well, if I have my way, he won't have a job this time next year. Next slide. And that's Richard Nixon. And do I have time to tell the short story or not?
I don't think so. But how to handle the tough ones.
Okay. Hey, this is, we'll tell this story and then we'll move on.
Not too long, just.
Yeah. Anyway, this was Richard Nixon. I got to fly to Iowa to the dedication of the opening of a dam. But this was about the time of slightly before the impeachment, and Rumsfeld would sit in the front row at the White House meetings. Dick Cheney would sit in the second row with the secretaries, and I, as an assistant special counsel, Rumsfeld would sit in the back row. And they're going around the room asking how the president should handle this issue of Watergate. And I basically, it was one of the few times I spoke, and I basically, and the inscription, you can't see it on here, but Rumsfeld's inscription quotes what I said to the president. And my quote to the president as to how to handle this situation was like, head on, Mr. President. Next slide. And this is the reason, again, for this presentation. These are just some of the children I need to tell, like you need to tell your children about their roots and about their wings and about love. Finally, now you've heard some about some of those, and I really emphasize just very few, some of those, who provided the roots and who have given me wings and lots of love, and have sustained me with love, including those here at the Community of the Covenant. And one last comment. And one last short story, which is not in the script, which I'm not supposed to do. And that's about the lady that I've been married to for 60 years and have known for 50 years and have known for over 60 years. When we got married, she called her mother and father, who were Irish, in case you haven't guessed by now. And she said to her mother over the phone, I got married to this guy and he's black. And he also has 2 kids. I had a chosen child, an adopted son, Kevin, and I had a child by my first marriage. And he's Republican. And to this day, she has never given me an honest answer as to what point in the conversation with her mother did she hang up. The good news and the happy ending to that story is that after that, and about 3 years after Pat's father had died, Lillian became very close to our children and became a doubting, loving, caring grandmother. So there is redemption and there is hope. And the last story I will tell you, and you will probably hear that this is not a true story, that at one point, and this was after, by the way, when my mother-in-law got married for a second time to a really nice guy, and the wedding was done by a black African-American Catholic priest, the only one within 250 miles of where we live, who sang Ave Maria and made my mother-in-law cry. So after all of this, things were really rosy, and things were, I had screwed up one day. It was one of those rare occasions where I screwed up. And my wife said to me, I would leave your blank blank, but unfortunately, I now realize my mother would probably testify in your behalf. So there is hope for redemption. And with that, I hope I've been able to convey to you the essence of the gospel lecture for the day. And that is the you don't have it out, but I can do it. Saying that is, unless and until the lion gets to tell his story, the story of the hunt will always be told by the hunter. Let us pledge and pray that we will do enough going forward, that our children will be able to live out that prayer. Thank you very much, and we will take questions.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was an amazing presentation and story, and it's so good to get to know you better through the telling of your story. To those of us who have known you for many years, we didn't know so many of those details, and especially about the significant part of your life that happened in the 1960s that shows that history is doomed to repeat itself a lot of the time. But hopefully we get a touch more wise with each telling and with each cycle.
And in some ways, just if I can interrupt, like, you know, the real story, the real heroes in some ways too are people like Colonel Kinzer, the colonel and the commanding officer who promoted me, and yet probably should have had me court-martialed.
That is true. So you didn't get court-martialed, and the rest is history. Thank goodness for all of us, and that resided in the future.
And I didn't know anything about the Watergate break-in, so and I was asked if I knew anything about the Watergate break-in, and I would say I was not there, I was not involved in that.
And you told him to don't cover it up, meet it head on. But little did you know that the coverage was worse than everything. We have time. We're going to run over just a little bit. If anybody would like to ask any questions of Ron, Susan, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Ron, how long were you in Cuba? And were there any other Black soldiers with you? I mean, we didn't go into battle in Cuba. So when were you able to come back to the mainland?
We were actually at Eglin Air Force Base, which is about just off near the coast of southern Florida. And so we never went to Cuba, but we were there for about 2.5 days.
Oh,
Yeah, so we were in Cuba for about 2.5 days. And that was after coming back from having been in Oxford, Mississippi for about a day and a half.
uh-huh.
I mean, these were all very intense times. But the one thing I didn't get to talk about was, like, there was actually an occupation in Oxford for like at least by 30,000 supply, Air Force, logistical, Army and Air troops in Oxford, Mississippi for over 30 days, for a continuous 30-day period after the actual Battle of Oxford. But that was mostly support battalions and National Guard units.
Thank you.
So I have a question, Ron. It's Ann DeConing. Is it true that you're going to Washington again?
How many times?
In terms of the answer is more than likely no. The current commander, the current Secretary of Defense was the commander of the 18th Airborne Corps when I was Assistant Secretary of the Army. And I would not describe us as friends, but we had a very good working relationship. And I've tried to be supportive of him. And the message I left for him when he was running for the nomination was, Lloyd, let me know. You know, I'm an independent now, but I've had some historical Republican connections, but let me know whether I can campaign for you or against you, because I'm prepared to do whatever will do the most good.
Thank you.
I have a question, Ron, Barb. You had mentioned how blacks had been used as strike breakers for the mining strikes that went on. And
Yes.
it just made me wonder to what extent the tough historical relationship with blacks and unions in this country has been, and if you think there's any, was that a commonplace practice to use blacks in that manner? And has that set up the history that went forward in the union life?
That's a very complex subject, but the short answer is yes. And the irony now is I now sometimes talk to black union employees who basically view Vietnamese, Mexicans, quote, wetback's an inappropriate comment, but to share with you the ignorance of even some of, quote, my people, or the insensitivity or the lack of awareness of their history. They sort of now talk about the immigrants or the other, and even sometimes Muslims. There's a lot of intolerance, unfortunately, among a lot of communities, including the African community, about Muslims, particularly among the evangelicals. So I think it's much more complex. That I think it created fractures with unions, and I think it's had kind of a rolling effect, and I think it's sort of even more so poisoned the waters in terms of how some blacks view, because one of the way blacks in the past have gotten by is becoming and acting like some of the bad acts of some white people. So I don't think it's a black or white question, but the answer is yes, but there's more to it than that. It's more complex. Does that answer your question?
That was a great answer. So we're about 5 minutes after. Is anybody else? We you know, it was such a rich talk. If it would be fine if there's another question, but if not, I'll look for hands. We really appreciate everybody attending, and I want to thank, and there's Pat. Hi, Pat. She was right there. And so thanks everybody for coming and for participating in this adult seminar. We've had a great series of seminars with Matthew 25, with Cassie and Colin and their colleague on reparations last week. And Ron capped off our Black History Month. But again, this is a year-round thing. It's not just February. It gives us a time to reflect, but of course, this is year-round. Social justice and racial justice is something that we have to face every day of the year. Thank you again. What's that?
And John, you should publicly thank Sybil for her support.
And thank you, Sybil.
PowerPoint tech.
All right. Thanks everybody for attending, and we hope to see you. We're going to be doing the Forum series continues next week with the Kerygma series led by Reverend Hudson on the Messiah, and there'll be little snippets of the choir, I hear, and
there'll be music notes as well that you can listen to and hear.
All right.